aware that in case of an emergency in this room, we will have to leave one of the exit doors. So be aware of those that are around you. And based on what the emergency is for and about, we may have to leave the building. You just simply go in the back in the lobby, go down the stairs, and exit the main entrance. Restrooms are on the I Street side of our building to the south. And also, especially those on the internet, we strongly encourage folks that have questions for Dr. Handy today to send them at first opportunity so that we'll have time to take them on the air. So with that, Jennifer.
Good afternoon. Nice big crowd today. I'm Jennifer Gray, and I have been ARB's contract manager for this SB 375 related research project with Susan Handy and Marlon Bornett and other researchers at UC Davis and University of Southern California. I'm very excited to be here today as Dr. Handy presents the results of this research on the science behind sustainable community strategies. Senate Bill 375, the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act of 2008, supports the state's broader climate action goals by calling for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions through better integration of transportation and land use planning, which is expected to result in more sustainable communities. Under SB 375, California's 18 metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, are tasked with creating sustainable communities strategies, or SCSs, that are largely based on integrated land use and transportation strategies intended to reduce vehicle miles traveled. ARB's task under SB 375 is to evaluate whether the greenhouse gas emissions reductions the MPOs expect their SCSs to achieve are likely to be achieved if those MPOs and local jurisdictions implement their plans and the strategies assumed in those plans. So ARB was interested in learning what the existing research says about the effectiveness of a variety of strategies and with respect to the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Specifically, ARB's goals were to review land use and transportation strategies that potentially reduce regional passenger vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, to inform analyses MPOs and local jurisdictions use for SCS development, to share evidence or associations between the strategies and greenhouse gas emissions, the strength of the associations, and the degree of the effects of the strategies, and to identify important data gaps and research needs in this area of study. Before I introduce Dr. Handy, I'd like to mention that this is just one aspect of a larger ARB research program, and if you'd advance the slide, thank you, that is focused on land use and transportation issues. ARB's Sustainable Communities Research Program supports the advancement of voluntary strategies to make our built environment more sustainable, including improving California's development patterns and transportation infrastructure and buildings. A few examples of other ARB research that ARB is funding that you might be interested in are an evaluation of the impact of light rail transit on travel behavior, research evaluating the potential impact of transit investment on displacement, and several projects aimed at evaluating options to reduce near roadway exposures. All of the Sustainable Communities research can be accessed at the URL on the slide here. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Susan Handy. Dr. Handy is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis, where she also serves as the director of the newly established National Center for Sustainable Transportation at the Institute of Transportation Studies. This is a consortium of leading universities committed to supporting federal, state, regional, and local agencies in improving the environmental sustainability of the transportation system through research, education, and outreach. Dr. Handy's research focuses on the relationships between transportation and land use, particularly the impact of land use on travel behavior and on strategies for reducing automobile dependence. In addition to this project, her recent work includes a series of studies on bicycling in Davis, a study on the effects of opening the first big box store in Davis, and the development of a method for estimating vehicle trip generation for smart growth development projects in California. Dr. Handy serves on the Committee on Women's Transportation Issues and the Committee on Transportation Education of the Transportation Research Board, and she's the Associate Editor of the newly launched Journal of Transport and Health. She received a bachelor's in civil engineering from Princeton University, a master's in civil engineering from Stanford, and a PhD in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley. Please help me welcome Dr. Handy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for being here and out there in the nether world somewhere. Thanks to ARB for funding this project and for giving me the opportunity to share it with you today. We hope very much that this will be a very useful resource for all of you. So as Jennifer said, the motivation for this research is, of course, SB 375 and the targets that have been set for the metropolitan areas for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As Jennifer noted, under SB 375, the metropolitan regions are required now to adopt sustainable communities strategies. And of course, the big question that they are struggling with and that ARB is struggling with is, how do we know what's going to work? How do we know what combination of strategies we can put into these SCSs that will get us to those targets? What's going to work? So how do we go about figuring that out? Well, one approach is to use travel demand forecasting models. So the MPOs are running their SCS strategies through their regional travel demand forecasting models and looking at what those models predict by way of how much vehicle travel there will be many years into the future, and then what this means for greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a very important part of the SCS process. But there are some limitations of this approach that we all know. One is that these travel demand forecasting models are, of course, based on a bunch of assumptions, like travel behavior is going to remain pretty much the same, in terms of kind of the fundamental principles of that into the future. There are assumptions about gas prices and all of that. So the forecasts that come out of these models are very much dependent on these assumptions. And then, of course, the other thing we're running into is that these forecasting models were designed to help us understand how much highway capacity we would need in a region. They weren't designed to help us understand what would be the impact of investing this amount of funding in bicycle infrastructure, for example. So they're a very important tool as a part of this process, but they have their limitations. And so that's where our project comes in, is to provide a different way of understanding the impacts of these potential strategies. A resource that would help the MPOs and others understand what's realistic to expect in terms of the benefits we will get from these different strategies. So our charge was to look at the empirical evidence that's out there in the research world on a whole bunch of strategies that I'll show you in a minute. And by empirical evidence, what I mean is actual observations of what's happened in the world. Studies where people have gone out and measured what's actually happening out there. So rather than a forecast based on a model, it's things that have actually happened. Okay, that's what I mean by the empirical evidence. So it was a two-part project. We started back in 2010, and we reviewed the evidence for 15 strategies that ARB identified. And then there was a second round of the project that ran from 2012 to 2014, where we updated some of those original policy briefs and then added 8 additional strategies. Marlon Bornett and I led this effort. Marlon was originally at UC Irvine when we started and then moved to USC. But we had a host of other very smart people helping us with this work. So I definitely want to acknowledge all of them. And I also want to acknowledge ARB and Jennifer in particular because they also had a big role in this. They reviewed everything we did very carefully, raised lots of really important questions. Do you really mean this? Is this really what you mean? So that the end product reflects much of their input as well. And I think Jennifer and I are both very happy that the work is now done and posted on the website. So there are 23 what we call policy briefs that give you the key information you're looking for, one for each of these strategies. And then with each one, there's also an accompanying technical background memo that goes into much more detail about the studies that we included in these briefs. Okay, so now a little more about what we actually did. So the strategies we reviewed, 23 of them, as I said, fell into different categories. We started with a bunch of different land use strategies: residential density, employment density, land use mix, connectivity, regional access, and jobs housing balance. There were a number that sort of fall loosely into this category of infrastructure and services. So distance to transit, quality of transit service, or more sort of amount of transit service, car sharing programs, pedestrian infrastructure, bike infrastructure, roundabouts. And then this last one is a little different, highway capacity, where it's kind of the reverse, right? So if we're talking about strategies to reduce GHG emissions, we're probably talking about reducing vehicle capacity rather than expanding capacity, as you'll see. And then it goes on. So another set of strategies that fall into what you might call operations. So eco-driving, getting people to change how they drive a vehicle so that their vehicles are operated more efficiently. Transportation systems management, including things like traffic signal timing, traffic incident clearance programs. Let's get those wrecks or those stalled cars off the road quickly so that the freeway moves more efficiently. And then fleet turnover strategies, or incentives, I'm sorry, which is, again, a little bit of a different strategy compared to the other ones we were looking at. Demand management strategies, including telecommuting programs, employer-based trip reduction programs, voluntary travel behavior programs, and then, of course, pricing. And we looked at gas pricing, parking pricing, as well as road pricing more generally. So, as I said, there are policy briefs about each one of these with the accompanying memos, and I invite you to go look at the website where you will find all of this rich, detailed information. What I'm going to do is talk in a more general way about kind of how this all works. And I'm going to not get very much into the specifics of any one of these topics. That's in part because we don't have that much time, and in part because there's so many of them that with my memory these days, I'd have trouble speaking very specifically about any of them without having it there in front of me. But there are a lot of really important points about the set of briefs that I want to convey to you today. So first thing to note is that our focus was on evidence from the peer-reviewed literature. So the kind of stuff that we academics produce, that we submit to journals where other academics review the work that we're doing, and then it gets published in one of these journals. So that was our goal, because that includes some level of quality control. At least in theory, that's what the peer review process is about. For some topics, we also included research reports that we judged to be of sufficient quality, even if they weren't peer-reviewed as officially as the other stuff we were looking at. And then we also relied, where possible, on published papers that were themselves reviews of the literature, just for efficiency's sake. So for a couple of these topics, there were already really great reviews out there, and so we relied a lot on those. Now, what studies did we include in our review? This varies a bit from strategy to strategy, just because the evidence looks so different depending on what it is you're looking at, whether you're talking about density or car sharing programs. But in general, as I said, we were focusing on what's the empirical evidence out there, the empirical studies based on empirical data, observations of the real world. Some of the topics like roundabouts and traffic systems management. There's some traffic simulation modeling that gets involved, even in these empirical studies. We tried to find studies that were based on data from California, since that would be most relevant to our context here. On some topics, there's a lot from California. On other topics, there's almost nothing from California. So where needed and where we felt it was appropriate, we went beyond California to include studies for the U.S. as a whole or for other states in the U.S. And for a few topics, we also drew on some international studies. We were looking for the best quality studies. Again, this varies a lot from topic to topic, just because they're, how you can study these different strategies is a little different. But kind of an overarching thing we were looking for is studies that control as much as possible for other things going on. So the study was designed in such a way that it would really tell you what the effect of this strategy is, taking away other things that could be affecting the outcome that was being measured. And then, of course, our purpose was to come up with a number, or what we call an effect size. So the study had to either report an effect size or provide enough information that we could calculate an effect size from what they had given us. Now, what do I mean by an effect size? Well, in general, what I mean is a change in, actually, for most of them, it's going to end up being vehicle miles of travel rather than GHG, but I'll come back to that point in a minute, per unit of the strategy, okay, which probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but let me show you how it comes out. Okay, so what's in these briefs, each one of these briefs, is our judgment based on the available evidence as to what the probable range of effect sizes is for each of these strategies. So, for example, density, residential density. What we concluded from looking at the literature out there, the evidence out there, is that it's reasonable to expect a 0.05 to 0.19% decrease in vehicle miles of travel for a 1% increase in density. Okay, so I'll show you an example in a minute that'll make that a little clearer, hopefully. But then you can see for each one of these, sometimes it's a percent decrease for a percent change or increase. For some of the strategies, it's a different sort of unit. So distance to transit, the unit was 1 mile closer. So for people living 1 mile closer, you get a 1.3 to 5.8% decrease in VMT for each person living 1 mile closer. Okay, so it's really important to pay attention to what these units are, and this also makes it very tricky for making comparisons, because we're really talking about some apples and oranges here. Okay, so you can't just look at those numbers on the right-hand column and say, oh, density, well, no, what does this look like? Car sharing or roundabouts clearly have the most impact. You can't do that because it's different units. Okay? So we've got the land use ones, infrastructure and services. Infrastructure and services gets a little trickier because these units change. And then operations, again, kind of the per what that unit is, that varies a lot depending on what we're looking at here. Fleet turnover incentives, for example, the way we ended up measuring the effect was the cost per ton of CO2 reduced. Okay, so some of them are a little different than others. And then demand management and pricing. Okay, so those numbers are all there up on the website, and you can pull those up and look in more detail as to what our conclusions were based on, what studies these came from, and then some of the concerns we raise about these, or cautions that we raise about these. Some things to note now. Different outcomes reported for different strategies. So for most of them, we what was available was evidence about their effect on vehicle miles of travel. Okay, which is pretty good. It's pretty close to what it is we're ultimately trying to look at, which is GHG emissions. So there, it's a reasonably direct conversion from VMT to GHG. If you're reducing VMT by some amount, you're likely to be reducing GHG by some similar amount. And in the briefs, we talk about some of the considerations that might make that translation more or less direct. There were a few of those strategies, though: roundabouts, transportation systems management, fleet turnover incentives, where the studies themselves looked at impacts on GHG emissions. And those were cases where, for these strategies, you get the GHG emission reductions without the VMT reduction. Okay, so what was directly measured was the effect on GHG. And then the other one that's really important to point out is the strategies that focus on the use of other modes, and in particular, transit, studies about transit, and studies about bicycling. Almost always report changes in transit use and changes in bicycling, and not changes in VMT or GHG emissions. And what's important about this is that you can't assume that the change in transit ridership or the change in bicycling directly translates into a reduction in VMT. So I've got another stream of research that looks at this question of substitution, as we call it, and shows that, in fact, it's not usually a one-to-one substitution. Some of that new biking is replacing driving, but some of that new biking is new biking, which is great for the public health people, but it's not helping us with our GHG emissions reductions. Okay, so on my previous slide, I had some NAs in there, not applicable. That was cases where, we weren't comfortable saying, what does this increase in bicycling mean in terms of a reduction in VMT? Because there's that other step in the process. Okay, so then what do these numbers mean? How would you go about using these? What did they say about what would happen if we implement these strategies? I am going to give you a totally hypothetical example, big caution sign up here. This is not based in reality, but it gives you an idea of how you might take these numbers and apply them to your situation, to the strategies that you and your communities might be proposing. So, for example, what if we could increase population density across the region by 1.5% between now and 2035? What does the evidence suggest we could expect by way of a reduction in vehicle miles of traveled? Well, if you could increase population density by 1.5, and you take the midpoint of our range of effects, you'd get a 0.18% decrease in VMT. So kind of small, but heading in the right direction and not zero. Question?
Sorry, can you tell us what geographic scale you're assuming? Is this all?
Yeah, well, that's part of the challenge of applying this. So I think the question is, could you apply this at a small scale as well as a large scale? Not entirely clear. Most of these studies, the studies are a mix of smaller scale and regional scale. So I said, if you heard me, what if we could increase population density by 1.5% for the entire region? Okay, so if you used our number in that way, then what I'm saying is you might expect a reduction in VMT of 0.18% for the entire region. If the density increase were for a small part of the city, then you wouldn't expect that decrease in VMT for the whole region. It would be for that smaller part of the city or the metropolitan area. But there it gets a little trickier because are you talking about the people who live in that area or are traveling into that area? So that's where it gets a little trickier, and that's why you need to read the policy brief and the technical memo before you apply these numbers.
Are you using a specific
No, this is, in applying this in my example, totally hypothetical. The studies, the numbers come from a number of different places as outlined in the policy briefs.
Okay, so for about how many square miles?
I can't answer that question. Okay, you're going to have to read the policy briefs and the technical memos. So like I said, I'm just doing this as a completely hypothetical, very vague example to just show you kind of what the numbers will look like. And then I'm going to get into some more of the issues. Okay, so if we do 1.5% for all of these land use strategies, maybe we get to something like something over a 1% decline in VMT. Now you should be starting to ask other questions too, and I'm going to come back to some of those. But just think hypothetically for now. Infrastructure and operations strategies or service strategies. So, what if we put a whole bunch of people closer to transit? What if we increase the service or decrease fares? What if we can get 5% of people in the region to participate? Okay, you can use the effect sizes we report in the policy briefs to get an estimate of what that might mean for a reduction in VMT and thus GHG emissions. So my completely hypothetical examples in this case add up to something quite a bit more. Now we're up to about 4% decline. We can look at the other categories, so operations strategies, demand management strategies, pricing strategies, same sort of thing. Plug in, some idea of how much change in this thing we might expect, and then we can use the effect sizes to see what that's going to mean in terms of a change in VMT. And then maybe we can add that all up, although that's another issue I'm going to come back to, and look at what does this mean overall. So in my completely hypothetical example, I got up to about an 11% decline in VMT if I made all of these changes. And in this case, think in terms of a regional scale. Okay, so that's sort of the way you can use it, is one point in going through this exercise. Another point in going through this exercise is to show you that it's probably going to be very hard for any one of these things to get you all the way to the target. And probably what we're talking about is some application of all of these strategies, or most of them anyway, to some degree, if we're going to add it all up to something close to the targets. And then, of course, the third point in going through this is to make you kind of uncomfortable about even doing this, because it raises all kinds of questions, right? We've already had a couple. Here are the ones I wanted to say a little bit about. Doesn't context matter? Is it Sacramento or is it somewhere else? Are the effects simply additive? Was it fair for me to put these all into one table and add them up? How realistic is a 1.5% increase in density, or the thought that maybe 5% of people in the region would participate in car sharing? How realistic are those numbers? And then, of course, how certain are we about those effect sizes that are reported in the policy briefs, those ranges that I showed you in the previous slides. So let me just say a little bit about each of these, because these are really, really important if you are going to make use of the numbers that we are giving you. So of course, context matters. If you implement a lift program in a very dense urban area, the outcome is going to be different than if you implement a lift program in a suburban sort of area or even a rural sort of area. Okay, so context does matter. Unfortunately, on most of these topics, we don't have enough studies that we can tell you how the effect varies with context. So you've got to look at the briefs and see what the context was for the studies that we are drawing on to give you the numbers that we give you, and see if you think that lines up reasonably with the context that you're talking about. So we need more research. Are the effects additive? I would say that yes, to some degree, in general, they are. You do a bunch of these different things, you will get effects from each of them that add up to some overall effect. But what gets a little complicated is some of these strategies overlap. So for example, if you increase densities, you almost automatically increase land use mix. So if you calculated an effect for each of those separately and add them together, you might be overestimating the effect that you would get. Conversely, a lot of these strategies complement each other. Pricing in particular is a complement to a lot of these other strategies. So if you do pricing in conjunction with a car share program or increased densities, you might get even more of an effect than if you just simply added up the separate effects. Because pricing is such an incentive to look at alternatives. So the additive part is also something we know, again, needs more research, and we can't, at this point, tell you very specifically about which way it's going to go. Is adding it up an overestimate or an underestimate? Then there's a question about how realistic are these changes? Again, a 1.5% increase in density or 5% of people participating in car sharing. For the strategies related to the built environment, so land use strategies, infrastructure strategies, we do have, in most cases, quite a bit of evidence on how that characteristic of the built environment affects travel behavior. So if we increase mixed uses, we've got some pretty good idea about what that means for vehicle miles traveled. But the piece that's missing that I want to make sure you're also thinking about is that what cities are doing is adopting a policy that's designed to change the land use mix, which is intended to change VMT. And what we don't have is a lot of research about how that policy affects the built environment. So that means that I can tell you that land use mix affects VMT, but I can't tell you that putting in place a zoning policy to increase mixed use development will give you that same effect. There's another step in there, which is where the policy has to have an impact on the built environment. And that's another area where we need some more research to better understand the effectiveness of the policies in bringing about these changes, if that makes sense. This is one we didn't even really realize until we were quite a ways through the project, that really we weren't looking at what the policies were doing. We were looking at this intermediate step. And the same thing for the other kinds of things that I just lump into the category of programs. So, we've got studies that show that car sharing membership has some relationship to VMT, but there's also the question about policies that would get people to join car sharing programs. What could cities or regions do, maybe it's a subsidy, that would increase that membership? We just don't have research about those kinds of policies. Okay. And then we get to the question about how good is the evidence anyway, all those studies we looked at. And this is my attempt, going back and reading through each one of these things, to categorize this a bit. And I do say this was my categorization. Marlon hasn't signed off on this yet, so I don't want to put words in his mouth. And at some point we'll go through it together and see if we can come to some agreement. The strong category, which I should probably call strong-ish, as my daughters would say, because even in the strong category, there are important limitations. I'll talk a little bit about that. These are topics where we have a pretty good amount of research that's pretty consistent in what it's saying. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's pretty convincing. Moderate, same sort of thing, except a little less, maybe a little less research. Limited, we may have a few studies that are very good studies with pretty convincing results. We just don't have very much of it yet. So some newer things like car sharing, there's just very little out there yet. And then in the weak category, I put stuff that surprisingly, when you look at the evidence, well, for one thing, the studies vary a lot in their approach, which makes them very hard to compare. But some of the results of those studies are a bit all over the place. So it was hard to come up with a definitive effect size, even a range for these topics. So again, those are areas where we need some more research, well-designed, to really bump it up to a higher category. Now, even with the strong evidence, the strategies with strong evidence, there are two big problems. Well, I'm sort of cutting across all of these, actually. And here I'm going to get a little researchy, but again, I think these are important points for you all who may be using these numbers to understand. One problem is cross-sectional studies versus experiments, and I'll explain that momentarily. As it turns out, most of the land use studies are cross-sectional, and that can be a bit problematic. And then experiments being the stronger research design, the kind of research that gets you better evidence. Even when we do have experiments, one of the challenges is that they tend to be very small. It's a study based on a pilot program, so they're not large-scale experiments. So that, too, creates some challenges. So cross-sectional studies, what I mean by that is that you compare different places at one point in time. And you see that people living in that kind of suburban style development that you see on the top, we see that that's associated with lots of driving. And then we see that in places, higher density places, mixed use places, transit friendly sorts of places, we observe a lot less driving going on. Okay, what this is doing is looking at telling us that differences in land use are associated with differences in travel. Different kind of places have different kinds of travel, which is good. I mean, that's very suggestive, right? But it's not exactly what we want. What we want to know is that there's a causal effect here, that the way the community is designed, in fact, causes the behavior, that it's the suburban development that causes all that driving, that it's the transit-oriented development that causes less driving. And to really show that there's a causal effect, what our studies would have to do is show that a change in land use leads to a change in behavior. That if we take a suburban place and make it denser, or we take people from suburban places and move them to denser places, that their behavior will change, right? Because that's what we're hoping, that if we change the environment, we'll get a change in behavior. Well, it turns out there are very few studies that do this on these land use strategies because it's very hard research to do. And the problem is what we call the self-selection effect. That it may be that we see these associations, that we see people driving more in the suburbs and people driving less in Midtown Sacramento because of the kind of people who've chosen to live in those places. So that if you took a suburbanite and moved them to Midtown, they would drive just as much as they were out in the suburb, potentially. And in fact, studies do show this a little bit. So we know that self-selection goes on and does account for some of that association we see between the design of a community and how much people are driving. Okay, so some studies do a better job of controlling for this, accounting for this self-selection effect than others. And again, this is something we talk about in the research briefs. And what all that really means is that what we need to be doing is more experimental type studies. So this is something that the Transportation Research Board's special report that came out quite a few years ago now, that was also sort of looking into the evidence on the land use strategies. This is what they concluded, is that what we really need are these before and after studies, also called natural experiments, intervention studies, policy evaluations, where you measure change. You look at the change that the strategy is bringing about, whether it's a change in density or a change in whether you're commuting or telecommuting, and then you look at what is the change in how much people are driving. And that's the most direct evidence of a causal effect of these strategies. So in an ideal world, we would have bunches of these experimental studies on all of these different strategies. But we don't. They're hard to do. The kind of programmatic strategies do lend themselves to this kind of research more than the land use and transportation strategies do. So we do have studies for telecommuting programs, car sharing programs, employer-based trip reduction programs that look like experiments. They're not perfect because they don't always have a control group. If you know anything about experimental design, that's important. How do you know that the changes you're seeing are really from that program and not something else that's going on? So they're not perfect, but we do have them, and that's a good thing. That's a very important thing. We just don't have very many. We need more if we're really going to be confident about saying what's the impact of this strategy. And we are starting to see these now also for the built environment, the land use and the transportation infrastructure kinds of strategies as well. These are much rarer because you're talking, big amounts of money for these changes in the built environment. And as it turns out, actually studying the effects that these investments are having is a pretty tricky thing to do. So I think you mentioned you guys are funding the Expo line opening. ARB contributed funding to that. I think Caltrans as well. Marlon Bournette led that with Doug Houston at UC Irvine. Very challenging project to try and quantify what the effect of that new rail line in LA was on how much people were driving. So the sort of our mantra now, Marlon and I go around talking about this all over the place, is that really what we need to make sure we're doing is as communities are adopting these strategies, whether motivated by SB 375 or for other reasons, as much as possible, we need to be evaluating the impact of those strategies. As they get put in place, we need to be measuring what the world is like before it goes in, measuring what things are like afterwards, and building up the evidence base about the effects of these different strategies. So that over time we can become more and more confident in our predictions about what the implementation of a particular strategy in a particular place is going to mean. So that's lots of research to be funding. But hopefully also we get to the point where communities themselves are doing some of this sort of evaluation. And we've got some folks from Sandag here, San Diego, where they've built data collection into the grants that they're making. I think it's just the before data collection for the bicycle and pedestrian grants. But at least there's data collection going on so that there'll be some way to tell after the fact what the impact of those investments have had in terms of how much people are walking and biking and driving. So that's a really important message that, that we drew out of this work that we did for ARB. Okay, now I'm going to wind up with kind of the fun stuff. I mean, I hope I haven't totally dissuaded you from using all this wonderful research we did. It is, I think, a very valuable resource, but I just want to make sure that people use it with caution and with good knowledge about the limitations of what the science at this point says. The message that comes through most clearly out of all of that is that, as I said before, not one strategy alone is going to be enough. Okay, I can't tell you exactly what impact each strategy is going to have in each particular situation, but I can tell you you're going to have to do a bunch of different things. So what we really need is a multifaceted approach, and that's in fact what the SCSs are. They're incorporating a whole bunch of different strategies to meet these targets. So what I wanted to do is just share with you to close out here kind of the way I think about this, how I make sense of all these different things that we could be doing, and then tie it back to the research that we did. So the first step, as I see it, is that you've got to make it possible to drive less. You know, if you want people to drive less, it's got to be possible. And that's where the land use and transportation strategies come in, where how we design our community, what transportation services and options we provide to people, we got to make sure there is some alternative, that people can do something other than drive. So that's a first step. But that's no guarantee that people will actually drive less. So that's where the other kind of strategies come in. So a second step, and maybe we skip over this one a little bit sometimes, but I think it's really important, is to help people see how to drive less. And this is where strategies like the voluntary travel behavior change programs that we looked at come in. Employer-based trip reduction programs are a lot about providing people with information, helping them see how they can do something other than drive. I think it is an area where we could think a lot more creatively, at least in the transportation field, about how we get people to see what their options are. And then again, that's still not enough. You know, people need to see what their options are, but how do you get people to actually want to drive less is step 3. And here we've got the carrot approach or the stick approach, right? So the stick approach, you make it harder to drive. So of course that's where pricing is really important. You know, we researchers know that pricing could have a very significant effect, but this is an example where it's that sort of that upfront question that's really important: is how do you change the pricing? You know, how can you make that happen politically? Capacity reductions is another approach used not very much in the U.S., but certainly to good effect in places like Europe. Our brief looks, as I said, at capacity expansion, because that's what the research is about. You know, if you widen the freeway, there's a little bit of evidence that shows that if you reduce capacity, you don't actually make traffic a whole lot worse, and you can reduce driving at least a bit. And that's evidence from San Francisco and other places. So the stick, make it harder to drive. And then here's an area where we really haven't done much research, or I think even much thinking about what we need to be doing. But the carrot, make it cool to drive less. The public health people have this down very well. You know, social marketing, that's been very effective. We haven't done much of that in the transportation context. But maybe things like Uber and Lyft, bike sharing, you know, maybe that is starting to have some of this it's cool not to drive effect, at least for the younger generation. I'm looking at Amy. So we'll see where this goes. But again, I think not only more research needed, but more thinking about what the strategies might be. And then, of course, at the same time, we've got to make sure that the driving that people continue to do, because we're all going to continue to drive to some degree, has less impact when they do drive. So this is where some of the other things we looked at come in, like transportation systems management, eco-driving roundabouts, you know, all the vehicle and fuel research we do at UC Davis fits into this category. And then another thing we spend some time looking at is road ecology and, you know, how you design roads and pavements and things like that. And there are ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through those strategies as well. So it really is going to take all of these things. And the other thing we know is because it's going to take all of these things, it's going to take action at all levels of government. So, you know, it's state policy at the top, sort of pushing change, at least here in California. Big questions about how the MPOs who've been given the responsibility for developing these SCSs and thinking about land use policy, how can they motivate the local governments who are responsible for actually implementing the land use policy? And we're doing some research in that, on that question as well. So, so a whole other body of research about just these connections and how we get policy flowing down to the ultimate outcome that we're looking for. One thing we do talk a bit about in the briefs that I think will help bring about some of this policy change is that all of these strategies have countless co-benefits. It was not a part of our scope to actually quantify the co-benefits for each of these strategies. It was enough to just focus on the direct effect on VMT. But we do talk in the briefs about what the potential co-benefits are for these different strategies. And some of them it works out a little differently, but in almost all cases they're pretty clear. Other environmental benefits, social and equity benefits, health benefits, and then I think what may really be helpful, the more that we think about it, is the financial benefits that all of this adds up to. And that may be the most persuasive thing in bringing about some of the policy change, especially at the local level. So that is what I wanted to share with you. I'm just going to end with 2 slides about our new National Center for Sustainable Transportation, so you all know that it's there, and a little bit about what we are doing. We are doing research, education, and engagement, like participating in events like this. And our research is focused on climate change and greenhouse gas reductions, looking at infrastructure as well as land use and demand management, as well as vehicles and fuels, with some thought to the institutional issues that cross-cut all of these themes. So we've got a series of white papers that will be coming out on various topics over the next year or so. And if you're interested, we'll get you on the mailing list for those. And then there'll be research coming along as well on all of these topics. So with that, I'm going to end and say thank you, and also point to Laura Podolsky, who's our engagement coordinator, who you can also connect with if you want to get on our mailing list and hear more about what we're up to. So thank you. Okay.
We already have one question from email. This is coming from Kristen Pauling from SCAG, and she's going to test your memory, Susan. Which strategies had the least amount of data from California, and which had the strongest evidence from California?
I am not going to be able to answer that too specifically without consulting the briefs. But off the top of my head, I would say the nice thing is that we have a lot of transportation researchers in California. So there is California research on a lot of these topics. A lot of the land use research, for example, has been done in California. And in fact, the rest of the country and the Europeans complain that too much of that research comes from California. So that's a good thing. Trying to think where we're especially thin. Seems to me there were no roundabout studies from California, for example. We're just implementing those now. We should be studying them. What's that? Car sharing was a lot California, not entirely. Any specific strategies people are interested in? See if I can, yeah. A lot of that was California.
Can you repeat that?
Oh, capacity. The question was, what about capacity reduction? Well, capacity increase. The research is almost all about capacity increases, and a lot of that has been done in California. And then, like I said, there's a little bit of evidence on capacity reductions, including a little bit of data about when San Francisco took out the pieces of freeway that were damaged in the earthquake, what happened to the traffic flow there. But otherwise, that comes from Europe, I think. Yeah, other questions?
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I think it's valuable to everybody that's here for
Hopefully.
a wide variety of reasons. I wonder what your thoughts are about using household travel survey data in conjunction with land use data to try and establish, when we have things like 50,000 records or so and pretty good maps of the landscape. Just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, a lot of the land use research has made use of existing travel survey data. A whole bunch of studies have been done with the MTC 2000 survey, for example, for one reason or another. The issue is that puts you in that cross-sectional category again. Deborah Salon, who was at UC Davis and just moved to Arizona State, did a really great project, well, some work for ARB, as well as some related work for Caltrans, where she made use of the California statewide travel survey, as well as the California piece of the National Household Travel Survey, and looked at differences in travel behavior by neighborhood type. So she developed this whole typology about different kinds of places, and then looked at how travel differs in those different kind of places, and has turned that into what I think is a very useful tool that I would point you all to as well. But again, it's cross-sectional. So it's saying people who live in this kind of place travel this way, people who live in that place travel like that. It's not telling us that if you change the land use, you will change the behavior. So it doesn't mean, we can't totally trust. We can trust the cross-sectional to some degree. Did I say that right? Yeah. It is good and suggestive, and the fact that there are strong associations is really important, but it's not as good as if we had studies that showed that when we changed land use, we actually did change behavior. So I think we should be doing that, but we also need to move on and do those other kinds of studies.
Taking another from the email. Let's see. This one from Josh Roll from Lane Council of Governments in Eugene, Oregon. Do we have any research, or is there anything you know of in the works looking at the impacts of pay-as-you-drive insurance on VMT and or GHGs?
Yeah, so that's not one we really looked at for one reason or another, and it's not something I personally have been following, but I believe they have been doing some evaluation of the Oregon pilot project. I just haven't seen the results of that, but I would point you to Oregon. That way? That way.
Thank you so much for your research and the presentation today. And I have several questions, but I'll start with one. How does your research and your findings relate to the CAPCOA guidelines, the CAPCOA GHG quantification? Yeah,
we were chatting about that a bit before the talk. So when we got started on our first project, that project was also getting going. So they were looking at a lot of the same literature we were, and we did a lot of sort of cross-checking as to which studies did you include in your review to make sure it was reasonably consistent. They looked at a wider set of things than we did, and then they took it another step where they took the effect sizes and sort of developed a way to convert that into GHG emissions reductions, which we didn't do. So I have not looked at that since then, so I don't know if actually what you're talking about is something different than what I'm talking about from back then. But yeah, so there is some consistency at the heart of it. It's just we focused on what are those, we put all our effort into kind of coming up with the best numbers we could for those effect sizes and thinking about what was the right range and all of that, and left it up to you all to then make use of those in doing whatever sort of GHG calculations you need or want to be doing.
So the elasticities are similar?
They should be. They were back then.
Could you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. So the elasticities that we report, we call them effect sizes in our policy briefs, should be very similar to what's in the CAPCOA tool for the strategies that overlap, unless they've changed things.
All right, a question from email from Nancy McDonald from the County of Napa. What do you think about the proximity housing programs? These are home ownership programs to reduce commute miles for our workforce with a direct tie to reductions of VMT or GHG. These programs don't currently qualify under the Strategic Growth Council's Sustainable Communities draft guidelines for the new cap and trade revenues.
Yeah, I'm just a little researcher. So that was not something we directly looked at, but I think you could look at some of what we've got that would help you understand what the effects of those might be, like the regional accessibility brief might be relevant there. anytime you put things closer together, there's a good chance you're going to be reducing VMT. But it's not always that simple. So I think that's as far as I'll go without having looked at the specific evidence for that approach.
Thank you. Two questions. One, can you speak to the variability based on socioeconomic characteristics? And secondly, do you have some advice for those of us who work with land use related paradigms for how we might support or encourage incorporation of measurement into different efforts?
Yeah, two questions. So first question, it varies by topic, the degree to which socio-demographic, economic income characteristics are accounted for. I would say, in general, I would be leery of applying these numbers to either extreme of the income range, because that's mostly not picked up in the kinds of studies that were included in our reviews. But some of those cross-sectional studies I was talking about, they do a lot of statistical modeling, so they'll factor income, they'll take the travel survey data, for example, and they'll include household size and auto ownership and income in this statistical model to control for those things, and then look at the impact of density and land use mix and all of that. So it is controlled for in some cases for some topics. But like I said, I would be leery of thinking that you would see these sorts of effect sizes at the extreme ends of the income range. You'd want to be careful about doing that. Your second question was about how to encourage this sort of
Speaking to the need for research.
yeah, speaking to the need for research. So part of it is, of course, funding. And one approach would be if the agencies that are giving out these grants require data collection to be done and some sort of evaluation to be done. And that's what SANDAG is doing. So that's one thing that would help. But the other issue we see is just a capacity issue. So local governments may not know what data they should be collecting or how they should best be collecting it to get real rigorous results. So me and my academic colleagues keep talking about, what we need to do is develop some robust but simple tools that local governments could use to do this sort of evaluation themselves. And we just haven't had time or funding yet to really work on that. There are a few things out there, though. There's been some great work done on measuring bicycling, for example, that communities could draw on. But I think we could be providing a lot more help to you all, even if we're not doing all of the research ourselves.
This is a multiple part question from Ginger Dykar at Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission. Can you suggest ways to get baseline data for our community prior to implementing a 30-mile rail trail over the next couple of decades? What type of data should we collect before, during, or after to best assess VMT reduction? And then I'll stop there, and then I'll ask her other parts.
Yeah. So this is exactly what I was just saying. It'd be great if we could provide a guidebook or something to these communities. Where in this situation, here's what we suggest. Here's the data you need and how you should go about collecting it. The tricky thing is, everything's a little different. Each strategy is a little different. You got to think about who's likely to be affected by that strategy. So if we're talking a 30-mile rail trail over the next couple of decades, that's tricky. Who does that rail trail affect? Is it really going to be about transportation travel? There's going to be a lot of recreational travel on that, so you would have to think about how to separate that out. Having a regional travel diary survey that is not too old is a great source of baseline data for almost anything, because that gives you a lot of data about VMT as well as how much walking and biking and transit use is going on. But of course, those are very expensive, and not every region has the luxury of having a recent one of those. So that's kind of a non-answer. You need to do some sort of survey of the population before, and you need to do some sort of survey after. And probably a year after, 5 years after, 10 years after, something like that.
Her next set of questions,
Yeah.
I'll bring all at once. How does your work compare to some of the other studies out there, like Moving Cooler and the CAPCOA report, which was already mentioned? Quantifying greenhouse gas mitigation measures, that's the CAPCOA report. Are the results consistent? Is your study based on more research and more recent research?
So I did talk about the CAPCOA study already. Moving Cooler I haven't looked at in a while, but I believe there's a lot of modeling as a part of that. Mike, I'm seeing some nods out here. So that was a different kind of evidence than what we were doing here. So they took models and then plugged in different assumptions and used the models to see what the possible outcomes could be as things changed. So complementary to what we're doing, but different kind of evidence. And I haven't compared. Well, again, not all of what we've presented here translates directly into GHG emissions. A lot of our work just tells you what the possible effect size would be in terms of change in VMT per unit change in strategy. So it'd be pretty hard to directly compare our numbers to Moving Cooler, I think. Our study, I would say, it's more about what all is out there in the academic literature, the empirical evidence, as I said, and it is a lot newer than Moving Cooler, but we do cite a lot of older studies when that's the evidence that's available. So apples and oranges, I think.
Yeah, I was very interested to see that the bicycling aspect you consider to have extremely weak evidence on, and I was wondering if that's a nature of not enough research has been done on this area, or if it's just kind of the nature of bicycling makes it hard to model. And related to that, are there ways you could focus in on certain types of bike infrastructure, perhaps limiting to only infrastructure within commercial areas or something like that, where you do get much stronger evidence that you could make projections or estimates based off of?
Yeah, biking. Well, this is one I think a lot about, so I can say more about this. The tricky thing about bicycling is, well, it's very easy to go out and measure how many people are using a facility. So there are studies going on that take a particular street and they measure how much bicycling is going on, and then you put in a green bike lane, and then you can go back and measure how much bicycling there is in that green bike lane. But what does that mean for VMT? It doesn't tell you anything necessarily. It could be that people have moved from some other street to that street. It may be the same people bicycling more. You just don't know what the overall change is. So what you need to do is surveys. Like I said, you need a population-based approach to measuring the impact. And then that gets tricky too, because you got to think about, okay, who's the population that's going to be affected by this new bike lane? How big an area do I think is going to be affected by this? And then you'd need to survey them to get at what is their VMT before, and then survey them again afterwards to see what's their VMT. Or you do something like intercept surveys would be another approach. Once the bike lane gets built, you can stop people using it and ask them, which is hard to do when they're on a bike. We've tried it. Easier with pedestrians. Were you using this route before this facility went in, or did you shift from another route? Or are you a new bicyclist because of this facility? What would you have been doing if you weren't biking here today? So there have been some studies like that kind of do that. Intercept approach is another way to get at it. But it turns out it's kind of a hard thing to figure out. So we don't have a lot of studies, and there are a lot of different methods that people have used.
So the only other part of the question was, are there subsets of the bicycle problem where you do feel we have strong evidence for? Is there a way to break it down?
Are there not Not off the top of my head. There is this Green Lane study going on out of Portland State. That's going to be our best evidence yet once it's done. I think some of it is already done, but there may be some more data collection still going on. Yeah, I can't, nothing pops out as being, oh yeah, we know, I mean, even bike sharing, we know a lot about the use of bike sharing, but we don't know that much about its impact on VMT. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you. I understand here in Sacramento and maybe other regions of the state, there, in attempts to produce better jobs housing fit analyses, there have been difficulties in accessibility to employment data, which I think you noted in the presentation. And from a research standpoint, has there been thinking about how to get around that obstacle? Does it really just come down to more household surveys, or?
The obstacle of not enough.
Of not getting enough employment data to really
Yeah.
be able to track where people are
Yeah.
traveling to work every day.
Yeah, I don't work with that much myself. I mean, there is, we get data out of the travel surveys, we get data out of the census. There are other sources of data that may not be readily available. It would be helpful if we had better access to that and had better data. I don't know. Mike, do you want to add to that at all? Okay. Yeah, no, I think in general, more data is what we need. But we should think strategically about what's the most important data to get, because sometimes, the big databases are helpful to a certain degree, but they're not really getting us exactly what we need. We need to design some more specific data collection to really answer the question.
From the emails, from Brian Reyes, from BAR Sustainability. Regarding car sharing studies, reducing VMTs being weak, what kinds of studies and/or data do we need to make a stronger case for this type of strategy?
Well, this is one where it's such a recent thing that we just don't have a lot of studies yet. So that it's not that the kind of studies that have been done are not the right kind of studies. It's just that we need more, is one thing. The control thing here is a little tricky. You can look at how much people in a car sharing program are driving, but the question is, what would they have been doing if they weren't in the program? Gets a little tricky. So it's a harder kind of study to design than you might think. There have been questions about the early studies. It was early adopters who were in these programs. So were those people going to be like the people who joined the programs later on? Questions like that. So I think we're heading in the right direction on this one, and it's a very popular topic, so we should have more good studies soon. It's just a little bit early for this topic to feel real confident about what we're seeing. And I'll just, my little editorial comment here is, for car sharing, it could mean more driving for some people and less driving for other people. So it's figuring out what's the balance. Is it attracting the people who are giving up a car or foregoing a car so that they are driving less than they otherwise would have? Or is it getting people off of transit and off of their bikes and into cars, in which case, it's increasing driving for those people potentially. So it is a hard one to nail down as to what the effect is.
Just a quick anecdote. Back many years ago, when the Energy Commission was housed out on Howe Avenue and had the prospect of moving downtown and the dread of lack of parking, soon after those same people moved downtown, their travel theories, strategies changed completely. They were delighted with transit, particularly light rail was there, and suddenly parking wasn't an issue, and the transit use was skyrocketing for them. So although there is a population selection issue, at least in that case, it was the same population that made a massive change in their different circumstances.
So that's a great example of a natural experiment. When a change like that happens, let's measure it and see what the change in the environment, in this case from moving people, and we're looking at a study like this for people moving into a new development, what's their change in behavior? When those kinds of things happen, we need to be putting some money towards measuring the effect of that change.
Right. You also have to worry about population aging, the same population that is. And the final point is just I wanted to make sure people would not believe I was here if I didn't say that VMT is a horrible surrogate for greenhouse gases. It's an extraordinarily nonlinear relation between the two, and you'll end up discounting the greenhouse gas effects of low-speed travel that you transfer from driving to walking or biking or transit.
Well, unfortunately, the research is mostly about VMT, so that's what we're able to report.
Do you want to take it on the air or go to one? Okay.
Thank you. Actually, it's a good segue from the speaker ahead of me. One of the questions I've been intrigued about is real-time decision-making, whether it's your Google or your electronic mapping that shows you, is it congested? What are my alternatives? I was particularly intrigued by this. I recently drove through Salt Lake. Coming down the Salt Lake corridor, they actually have a separate expressway. It's a tollway. You drive through it, you pay per mile of use, but people seeing congestion ahead choose to pay more to drive. And the segue for GHG that I thought about is we're focused. I clearly think we're on a better path, reducing trips, reducing vehicles. But what is the potential in our research that we can reduce GHG through those types of actions that actually increase the level of service and the traffic flow? And most of that, we've kind of ignored that for the engineering world.
Yeah. Well, you need to look at our transportation systems management brief, because we do talk about what evidence there is for some versions of that approach. Roundabouts is a similar sort of topic. And it's a little hard to figure out. That's where traffic simulation models have been an important tool in trying to estimate what those GHG effects are of these different strategies, like variable message signs or ramp metering or roundabouts. Our partner, Matt Barth, down at UC Riverside, they're doing some really interesting research on this, on how these kinds of strategies affect GHG emissions. So I would refer you to his shop as well. But then the other thing that's a little tricky about all of those is if you improve the efficiency of the system, smooth things out, keep people moving, that's good from an emissions standpoint, kind of immediately. But are you, in effect, increasing the highway capacity by doing that, which could lead to induced travel, which is another one of our briefs, the highway capacity brief, that then, offsets whatever benefit you've gotten in kind of the immediate short-term effect of that. And I don't think we just don't understand that very well yet. But look at Matt Barth's work and look at our TSM brief.
From Yongping Zhang from SCAG, a transportation modeler. How do we examine the correlation and interaction effect among those strategies? Are there any existing research or studies to quantify that?
Yes and no. So that whole land use category, in conjunction with some of the transportation strategies, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of those studies, which are cross-sectional, have these statistical models that have a lot of these variables in there at the same time. So it'll have land use mix and what's the density and how much transit service is there, and they'll represent a lot of that in the model. So those studies you can you can control for one and then look at the effect of the others. I don't think very many of them actually look at the interaction effects, but there might be a few out there. So yeah, there is some of that, but probably not really what you're looking for. If you look at I would say look at the population density brief and the studies that are listed in there, and then you might go look at the studies themselves and see some of this kind of analysis. But as I think I said in my talk, there's a lot we don't understand about these interaction effects still.
Yangping's second question is, how do we get these briefs and technical memos?
Yes, very easily. I realized this morning that I didn't have a slide that actually had the website in there. But I know that if you go to Google and you Google SB 375 research, it's the first thing that pops up. So that's the easiest thing to do. Yeah, so it's the ARB website that has all of these briefs and technical memos listed there. Very easy to find.
Thanks again. So if you, from your research and experience, if you had to choose, let's say, 2 to 3 indicators of whether a project will have low VMT, so for whether a development project will have relatively lower VMT, what would those 3 indicators be? And if you want more background sorry? Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
And if you want more background for what inspired that question, I'd be happy to tell you, but I didn't want to waste time.
I have a guess, but okay, don't quote me on this. I don't think this will be citable in any sort of lawsuit or anything, but regional accessibility is a really big factor, meaning how far out from the center are you? If you're far out, you're going to have a lot more VMT than if you're close in, just because you are farther away from things. You're farther away from the grocery store, you're farther away from the school, you're farther away from jobs, all of that.
Being the region center or the cities?
Well, a little of both, and it works at both levels. So, oh yeah, so am I talking about the regional center or the city center? There's going to be an effect of both. So, so let's see. So if you live in Midtown Sacramento, that's probably the least VMT. Again, don't quote me. We could go look up the numbers. You live in Davis. You're far out of the regional center, right? But and then within Davis, if you live, so if you're commuting to Sacramento, you'd have longer. Let's say the person works in Sacramento, downtown Sacramento, at the Capitol. So Midtown. You're close to the regional center and the city center, you're likely to have the lowest VMT. Davis and commuting to Sacramento, you've got a long commute, but if you live near downtown Davis, then you're probably not traveling very much. You're near the city center, so your daily travel, not your commute travel, but your other travel, is probably pretty reasonable, pretty low, especially if you bike. And then, but if you're, I'm not going to pick on anybody, somewhere in some random development that doesn't have a town center and you're far out from where your job is, that's going to be the most VMT. Right, so I think, there's, I talk about this with my students in my planning class. There's location and there's design, and they both matter, but location is really huge, location, location, location. So I think that's the first thing, and then looking at the design in terms of how close are people to the non-work destinations that they need to get to? And can they get there some way other than by driving? It's going to be within reasonable distance, but you've also got to have good connections. Okay, so regional location, proximity, and connectivity. Good connectivity. How's that? I like that.
Thanks, Susan. I have a question about the strategies reviewed, and I'm scanning the list and not immediately seeing bike share. And I'm wondering if bike share is on there or if you have any thoughts or plans about evaluating it.
Yeah, well, how that list came about is, I don't know, it was a lot ARB motivated, but also our thoughts about where there was enough evidence that it warranted looking at something. I'm pretty sure we mentioned bike sharing in the bike brief is very broad. So it's probably mentioned in there. But that's also a very new thing, and so the research is just kind of coming out. So that's why. So probably in a year or two, we'll know a lot more about that, and one of these should be written. And whether that gets funded, and I'm the one who gets funded to do it, I don't know. Yeah.
So I noticed that there wasn't anything in there about freight, and so I'm wondering maybe it wasn't part of this project, but is your institute looking at the sort of shopping freight trade-off?
Very good question. It was not really in our lists at all, but our colleagues at USC and CSU Long Beach are doing a lot of work on freight and thinking about land use and freight. So work just getting underway, but I would point you to Jen Giuliano at USC. Genevieve Giuliano. Or if you email me or Laura, we can connect you to her. Yeah, so they're launching a really interesting study on kind of urban land use and freight and how to put those things together. Yes, yes. More.
From Albert Perdon, did you evaluate the impact of changing the design of a city from an auto-dependent city to an auto-independent city? An auto-independent city is a city that has square block patterns designed for the auto, high parking requirements, low density. An auto-independent city is a radial city, like the spokes of a wheel, with severe parking limitation, very high quality transit and pedestrian infrastructure. Did you look at the design elements of cities with high transit and low auto characteristics?
Yeah. Well, as I said early on, we were looking at empirical evidence in this study. So had there been a city that had been changed from auto-dependent to auto-independent, and a study of that done, we could have cited that. But as far as I know, that has not been done. What we do have is evidence about some of the different pieces of this. So there's a policy brief on density, a policy brief on mixed use, a policy brief on street connectivity. So it is sort of the pieces of what you're talking about. But no, as far as I know, there has not been a study like what you're proposing. Instead, that would have to be done using forecasting models to plug in, hey, what if we designed a city this way? What do we think the outcome of that would be? But that was not the kind of evidence we were looking at.
Thank you. Thank you again for this. This was a great presentation. We're starting down the path of looking at specific projects and how projects can be, how you can quantify the reductions from a certain project and how the project is designed. I know there have been some questions earlier, and you had said you were not entirely clear about how, talking on a regional, large scale, I guess I would ask for some guidance on how we could use this information to look at specific projects that are developed to support sustainable planning.
Right, that's an important and challenging question. So almost all of the land use related strategies are on more of a neighborhood or regional scale. It's not, there weren't studies about, at that project scale. So to what degree can these larger scale numbers translate down to that? I am not confident in saying and giving you a specific answer to that. This is an area where, we're going to have to do some really quick thinking. I would point you to another project that Anne-Marie mentioned in my introduction, which was a Caltrans project, where we developed this method for producing more accurate estimates of trip generation for infill projects. So that is project scale. Now, the problem is we were focused on numbers of trips and not VMT. But it does give you a way to kind of adjust things, right? So, you know, if you know anything about trip generation, it's all based on these suburban sites is where all the data had been collected, and that's just, you know, that's going to overpredict vehicle trips for an infill project. So we came up with a way to adjust that, and it's like a 50% reduction or thereabouts, depending on what kind of land use and what the conditions are. So you could use something like that as an adjustment to VMT as well. We did collect data that would let us look at VMT, but that was not a part of the scope of what we did, so we haven't gotten around to analyzing that yet. So that may be a little bit of help, but not all of the help that you want and need. So, but maybe between the two of those, it gives you a sense of what, you know, what kind of difference does it make to do this project rather than the typical project. We need to be collecting data. Yeah, more data, more data.
This is just a follow-up comment from Josh Roll from Lane Cog in Eugene, Oregon. He just says that the response that you gave was in regards to VMT user fee, not the pay-as-you-drive insurance program, which is a private sector program that charges people per mile for their insurance instead of a flat fee per month or each 6 months or something. So I don't know if you have a comment on that. But
well, I think I said it was not really my area. So yeah, so thank you for that clarification. And yeah, I don't have the answer. Yeah.
And I think we have just one last email question anyway. This is from Arjun Sarkar from UC Santa Barbara. Did the research look into electric vehicle usage as a means to decrease fuel or GHG reductions, or do you think that this could be a component of SB 375 moving forward?
Well, of course, there's a lot of research going on vehicle and fuel technologies and its role in all of this, and a lot of work being done by my colleagues over at UC Davis. But it was not a part of what we worked on. But I think it is interesting to think about, you know, not just the vehicles and the fuels, but what about community design do we need to be thinking about to support the adoption of these alternatives? And again, was not within our scope, but would be interesting to pull that into the whole SB 375 kind of land use SCS discussion.
Do you know if anybody is looking at some sort of whole design from whole cloth, like what would be a town that wouldn't have any car trips? What would that look like, and how would it work together? Is anybody doing anything like that?
Yeah, kind of that pie in the sky stuff you might expect an academic to be doing. Yeah, well, that was kind of like this previous question. Well, my colleague Mark DeLucchi at UC Davis did some work on I think he calls it Past Town. It was a few years back, but sort of thinking about it wasn't completely PASS, like PASS town. Again, we can connect you to this if you're interested. It wasn't entirely car-free. It was, but it was sort of separating out, you know, regular vehicles from little neighborhood vehicles, and you know, so there is some of that kind of thing going on. There are communities in Europe that are essentially car-free, or supposed to be. Vauban in, am I getting this right? Anybody else know these? In Freiburg has got a community there, and there's one in Stockholm. So yeah, there is some of that thinking going on, but whether they are really entirely car-free. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sounds like a fun exercise.
Yeah, I could say just for a moment to that, there are some little groups around the world who have studied and theorized about car-free cities and looked to some examples. Of course, you know, 5 or 6 generations ago, however you define generation, there weren't cars in cities because there weren't cars. And there are still many places in the world, particularly in less developed countries, where you don't see that many cars, and islands and so forth. So there is some opportunity for research, and I know that the Towards Car-Free City Conference existed until recently, and there was actually a car-free research group formed there. So there's a limited body of information about it and a lot of potential. There's a website called carfree.com that links to many resources, and a book called Car-Free Cities by Joel Crawford, who also does that website, and he puts out a regular newsletter. And that book and his follow-up book, Car-Free City Design Manual, I think, something like that. I should remember the title, but gives a lot of detail about the theoretical possibility, and then mechanisms to actually transition existing car-dependent, if that's the term, cities. There are some interesting mechanisms out there, like transfer of development rights, where you would set up a long-term plan to basically just redevelop areas and bring back natural features. And the reference design in that book says that you will, the longest trip in a city of 1 million would be 35 minutes door to door, and you'd have a lot of co-benefits like accessibility and energy savings, and it would use about 80% less land. So you'd have a lot of opportunity for local agriculture, parks, connecting centers with bike paths, etc. So.
Thank you. Very interesting work. I think there's the issue of then how do you bring that about?
Hi, Susan. You started your presentation off with the various MPO targets for 2020 and 2035 for the sustainable community strategies, and you even gave us a hypothetical summary for regional targets for VMT reduction given your current briefs and research. Have you been tempted to look back at the MPO assumptions to see if they were too conservative or too liberal?
I have thought that would be a good thing to do, but haven't had the time myself. But I believe Jennifer, your group is doing that to some degree. Yeah. No, do you want to?
It's always on our mind to track what's going on, what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that would make an excellent paper. Might make some enemies along the way.
Any other questions? Well, I think this has been a great discussion.
Great questions.
Really appreciate your
Thank you.
work.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. The webcast will be posted within about a week or so from today's conversation. So if you want to play it again and again, you've got that opportunity. Thank you, everybody.